We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years, since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the darkened hour.
Hello everyone, and hello Adam.
Hey, good evening, Richard.
Okay, today we're going to be talking about Ayman al-Zawahiri, leader of Al-Qaeda. Adam, you've been doing some more study on him recently, so I think maybe I'll just turn over to you for a while, and you can maybe do a bit of a lecture on al-Zawahiri's life, whatever you want to say there, and then I'll pop in with some questions that whatever occurs in my mind. Is that agreeable as a way to proceed?
That sounds, yep. Yeah, that sounds fine. Most of what I'm going to talk about comes from the book written by Montasser Al-Zayyat, and the name of the book is The Road to Al-Qaeda. Zayyat was a close friend and an associate to Ayman al-Zawahiri for many years. A little bit about who al-Zayyat was. Al-Zayyat was initially rounded up as a suspect in Anwar Sadat's assassination, where he was detained for 3 years and released due to insufficient evidence. He met Ayman al-Zawahiri there in Egypt, in which al-Zayyat later became a lawyer and had Ayman al-Zawahiri as a client, in which he became later on strongly critical of al-Zawahiri's policies, and even quoted from the Washington Post as saying, quote, "He always thinks he is right, even when he is alone," end quote. A little bit about the ideology that these Egyptian cells, which I will talk about in just a minute, and I think this is important for anybody following along. Islamists believe that all Arab governments are practicing what they call Jahiliyyah, which means ignorance or paganism. All Muslim lands, as well as led by secular governments, should be governed under Sharia law, Islamic law. And that there are 4 sources of Sharia law, one coming from the Quran, one coming from the Sunnah, which is the authenticated hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, which came after Muhammad's death, the qiyas, which are the analogical reasonings behind the laws, and the ijma, which is the juridical consensus, the lawful consensus behind Sharia law. Now, Islamists are distinguished from mainstream Muslims, and that's because they are more politically active in promoting a government based on those Islamic lawful principles. And also Islamists also believe in using the term dawah, which is the invitation to Islam. The dawah approach, which is to achieve social change through a bottom-up approach, through the societal into the government. And the term dawah literally means calling, which refers to the practice of Muslims calling others to the right path, or a life guided by Islamic orthodoxy. Now, Jihadi Islamists are a minority within the Islamist movement, and they believe in a more militant approach to social change. In terms of enacting violence against government, secular government, the questionable point in Islamist circles has always been whether they should target civilians through these like terrorist actions. And in the very beginning, through the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood, they were dead set against this. And this was in the works of, say, Hassan al-Banna, who was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, even the more radical Sayyid Qutb, who was a co-founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was very keen to overthrowing secular governments, but not at the behest of civilian people, because they figured that if you enacted violence or terrorist violence towards the civilians, it would basically almost be hypocritical to what they were trying to enact, which is Sharia law within the government. Because if you don't have the backing of the people, well, what good is a Islamic government? So that's why they were against committing acts of violence against even non-Islamic civilians. This in itself would become a very important focal point in the future of jihadi groups when al-Zawahiri became a more visible fixture after the Soviet-Afghan war, when he influences people like Osama bin Laden to extol asymmetrical warfare, even at the behest of civilians, starting in 1998, when the World Islamic Front stated that all U.S. and Israeli civilians are to be killed wherever you find them. A long cry from Islamists like Abdullah Azzam, who was a Pakistani imam who denounced such activities, as well as Umar al-Talisani, who is the third general guide, the leader of the Islamic Brotherhood, who announced violence should be used as a last resort. And a quote, I'll use a quote to al-Talisani, according to this consensus, violence can only be applied only as the last resort and only following an application of the jurisprudence of balances that indicates that success is certain and that the harm caused in the process would not be greater than the benefit incurred, end quote. Now, a little bit about al-Zawahiri himself. Al-Zawahiri grew up in a neighborhood called Mahdi in Cairo, Egypt. His father, Muhammad Rabi al-Zawahiri, was a surgeon, and he taught at Cairo University. His mother, Umayya Azzam, was politically active and came from a very wealthy family. She was the daughter of Abdel Wahab Azzam, who was the founder of King Saud University, the first university in Saudi Arabia. Ayman has a younger brother, Muhammad al-Zawahiri, and a twin sister, Hiba Muhammad al-Zawahiri. And both siblings exclaimed that at a very young age, Muhammad was a very quiet, a very shy, studious child, a voracious reader. He hated contact sports and thought they were inhumane, a thought that was also extolled on by Sayyid Qutb, who would also remark that he saw a boxing match while he visited the United States around the summer of 1947, in which he saw a boxing match in Colorado and said that it was inhumane and barbaric. It was in the summer of 1965, where Ayman al-Zawahiri would join the Muslim Brotherhood. And 1 year later, Sayyid Qutb, who would have a resounding effect in Ayman's life, was executed. During this time, Zawahiri excelled in all his studies wherever he went. And then he then served in the Egyptian army in 1975. At the same time, in 1978, he's earned his master's in surgery from the University of Cairo. He was always an avid follower of Sayyid Qutb's works, including the infamous book Milestones, in which he preached that to restore Islam and free Muslims from Jahiliyyah, ignorance, and paganism, there would have to be this vanguard of true Muslims, which would model itself after the original works of the Prophet Muhammad. And this had to be developed from the government itself. In other words, he wanted to institute Islamism, or what they call the political Islam, not from the bottom down, but from the top down, And that's what differentiated Qutb from the works of other older Islamist imams. This vanguard, if you will, would have to be willing to commit to physical change of the current Arab governments, even if by force, because Qutb actually thought that political Islam would not come through through necessary peaceful means. So Zawahiri, Ayman al-Zawahiri, would be arrested due to his contact with those with Sadat's assassination in 1981. Even though he wasn't primarily involved. Most of the people that were around, I think it was about 380 people total. It could have been more. That was rounded up by the newly elected president, Hosni Mubarak. Sadat actually had a tentative relationship with the religious sector, actually gave them a little bit leeway, as opposed to Gamal Nasser, the predecessor, before Sadat, the president of Egypt. Nasser was actually a hardline nationalist and really cracked down on the religious sector. In order to, and Sadat, actually, I think this was a mistake he made, was that he was very lenient toward the more hardline Islamist groups that arose out of that presidency. And this probably led to his assassination, if you will. And when Zawahiri was in prison, he was subjected to unrelenting torture by members of the State Security Investigation Services. I'll just call them the SSI for short. And it was found out through these torture sessions that even at a young age of 16, al-Zawahiri led a very unique and clandestine cell of radical Islamists, in which al-Zawahiri taught the members about the ideological and Islamic framework that they should use in performing Takfir, which is the declaration of a regime as indefensible. And his criteria for judging political leadership were disseminated undercover between these members. And the members were the following. Sayyid Imam Abdul Aziz, quote, or more commonly known as Dr. Father. He would be known as one of the primary founders of Islamic Jihad in Egypt, and was also one of the primary founders and the architects of the founding of Al-Qaeda many years later. Assam Yusuf al-Dumeri, a financier and a pharmacist, who generated funding to the cell using the profits in which he generated from his pharmacy. Muhammad Abdel Rahim al-Sharqawi, who was in charge of recruiting for the organization, and he too would use his employer's profits to fund the group, he worked in a tannery workshop. Muhammad al-Zawahiri, the younger brother of Ayman al-Zawahiri, was a civil engineer, was also another financier for the group. And probably one of the more important members, Isam al-Kamari, who was a high-ranking officer in the Egyptian army. Now, he was one of the more important members and a close friend to Ayman al-Zawahiri because he had a link to other jihadi members, as well as to having a link to the army itself, in which they would be responsible for the assassination of Anwar Sadat. This group, many years later, would be named the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Now, Zawahiri, even though he received the worst of the torture sessions, not because they suspected he was a part of Sadat's assassination, in which he wasn't, well, only because he knew he was associated with members of the Egyptian army, and they wanted to know the names of those involved with al-Jihad, Tanzir al-Jihad. Now, he would eventually give up his closest friend, Isam al-Kamari. This I think is very important because it was at this moment, because he gave up al-Kamari. Meanwhile, how he gave him up was that Ayman al-Zawahiri went to the mosque, which, by the way, was funnily named the Kit Kat Mosque. You wouldn't think that name would be like for a strip joint, but it was named the Kit Kat Mosque in Egypt, in southern Egypt. And it was during the morning prayers at the local mosque in which Ayman al-Zawahiri walked in, and that was the code for that al-Qamari was present at the mosque, and the SSI came there and they eventually arrested him. This is a huge point in al-Zawahiri's life because he never got over this. And he didn't mind the torture, but he minded that he was actually an informant for the SSI. And this bothered him. And al-Zayyat, who is the author of the book, noticed this in his talks with Ayman al-Zawahiri at Torah prison, in which both of them were in prison, and that he says that almost on a daily basis that he actually never got over giving up his friend al-Qamari, who, by the way, escaped prison in 1988. He broke out and was never to be seen again, actually, whether he hid out or was executed, no one knew anything about him. There are many, after Nasser after Nasser's presidency, many small jihadi groups were in Egypt at this point. One of them was Gamma Islamiyah, which was led by basically university students from Upper Egypt, which was considered the more enlightened part of Egypt. This group was led by Karam Zohri. Another was Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was led by Abu al-Zamar, in which Ayman al-Zawahiri would later be named the successor in 1984 when Zawahiri was released from prison and Zamar was sentenced to life for being involved with Sadat's assassination, but he was released in 2011. Zomar was also a member of the Egyptian army, and he previously attempted to assassinate Sadat himself on several occasions, but he failed on multiple occasions and just left it up to Tanzim al-Jihad, the group that was responsible for killing Sadat. And he supplied these members, most notably Khalid Essambouli, who was to serve as the platoon leader of the security for the October 6th parade in which Sadat was killed. Zomar was a high-ranking member of the Egyptian army. And many of the people that were involved in that assassination of Sadat all were members of the Egyptian army. And in 1979, Mohammed Abdel Salam Farag managed to unite all these jihadi groups into one leadership. And in 1980, he made an agreement with Karim Zodi, the leader of the Gamma Islamiyah, to unite all these jihadi groups with the Gamma Islamiyah. And all these smaller groups were, the leader of that group, the smaller groups, was the infamous blind Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, who at that time was a professor at the faculty of Al-Sul al-Din, which is the fundamental Islam, at the Al-Azhar University in southern Egypt. The group would now be renamed Tanzim al-Jihad and would be led by Farag. But after Sadat's assassination, the SSI became an immediate crackdown under Hosni Mubarak on all jihadi Muslims, and mainly from two groups, the Gamma Islamiyah and the Tanzim al-Jihad, led by Faraj. Mohammed al-Salam Faraj. Now, Faraj is important because Faraj would author a book called The Neglected Duty, which was found in a raid of his home by Egyptian authorities, in which that book would be very important because in the book he argued that Muslims need to emulate the decrees of the Prophet Muhammad and stop practicing paganism. And much of the book is discussing concerning Islamic legitimate methods of fighting. Now, this is really important because this is where they actually believe in the practice of what they call taqiyya, which is basically lying to propagate Islam in terms of warfare. But in this book, it goes that Takfir, taqiyya needs to be practiced in all aspects of life, and which it's deceiving the enemy, lying to him, and attacking the enemy by night and killing civilians. And this book was actually spread to the high-ranking members of Tanzim al-Jihad and Gamma Islamiyah. And then this ideology then disseminated to all these radical Islamic groups. And they were all, by the way, now into two primary groups. And so they were competing with each other in prison. But Faraj was an avid follower of Sayyid Qutb, but he had disagreements with him. He had specific views which regarded their primary targets for jihadi terrorist activities, which should be local to regimes, in which he called the near enemy, in contrast to the far enemy, which he labeled Israel. This was also echoed by Ayman al-Zawahiri much later on. He also believed that peaceful means could never bring about a true Islamic society, echoing the same sentiments of Qutb many years ago. But the difference is that Qutb didn't believe in killing civilians, whereas Faraj actually does in order to achieve these means. And the reason he gave for participating in Sadat's assassination was not because of him making peace with Israel, but instead it was instituting Sharia law in Egypt. And the first category of detainees that were arrested by the SSI, including those actually implemented the assassination during the military parade, these were the primary suspects in assassinating Sadat. And that was Khalid al-Islamboui, Abdelhamid Abdel Salam, Atatayel Hamida Rashid, and Hussein Abbas. All these people were members of the Egyptian military, because according to Faraj and Abdul Zayoud, the key thing was to get people within the military to enact a coup, so to implement Sharia law from the government and then to implement it to the public. They would follow in line. This was the essence of Qutb's ideology, in which he wanted to implement Sharia law or Islamic rule of governance from the government on down. The difference was that Faraj wanted to implement it from the bottom up, and that was to have the terrorist activities to civilian populations. But Ayman al-Zawahiri would go a little bit further than that, in that he took these ideologies of Faraj and Qutb and then implemented it abroad. And he would start killing who? The civilians of the quote unquote the Western imperialism powers of the United States and Israel. And so the accused members in prison, Faraj and Rahman, and the rest of the members who knew of the assassination and participated one way or the other, they were tried and they were found guilty, one would expect. Omar Abdel Rahman was hardly ever tortured, and he was released because he was blind. Zawahiri was released after 3 years. Now there's some speculation as to why Ayman al-Zawahiri was given such a light sentence, even though he had connections to Tanzir al-Jihad, and of course he knew members of the Egyptian military. And one aspect is, one area of speculation is that he was continuing to be an informant for the SSI. And this led to many people to also contemplate that he was also an informer for the Central Intelligence Agency. And one person who actually believes that was Sibel Edmonds, who under Operation Gladiator.
Maybe just, I mean, perhaps not everyone knows who Sibel Edmonds is, so that's quite a big story in itself, right? But Sibel Edmonds is a Turkish-Iranian lady who lived in the United States and post 9/11 worked as a translator for the FBI, and later became one of the most, I'd say, one of the most prominent whistleblowers regarding foreknowledge of 9/11, and went on to have this whistleblowers coalition. And yes, some of the presentation she gave referred to Ayman al-Zawahiri having a long-running relationship with NATO, particularly relating to what his activities in the 1980s and his travel through Europe into the United States, the 90s, sorry, more than 90s, into the United States in 1993, and his detainment in Russia for a period of several months. But Sibel, it's a very interesting source. She's not suggesting that he was being unconsciously used by NATO as part of these false flag operations. She was saying explicitly that he was a double agent working on behalf and having high-level meetings with NATO members. And it's really like impossible to imagine, you know, but something that, like, it's very possible to imagine he was being used by them, right? Because as we've covered in episodes on the series, the CIA and the Western powers were playing this great game throughout the stands in the 1990s and into the breakup of Yugoslavia, of using the Mujahideen to ensure that these new emerging Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan countries were tilted in the direction of Western interests as opposed to Soviet interests, and the force you could do with that was Islamic proxies, and to assist with the breakup of Yugoslavia for geopolitical aims. That's the line we went down in the series. And yeah, Ayman al-Zawahiri and his brother Mohammed are players within that. So, you know, they would have been working in alignment with NATO interests. Okay, we could say that, in alignment with CIA and Western corporate interests. But what it's like really hard, I think, to take on board Sibel's stuff about, like, he was going in having high-level meetings with NATO guys in Azerbaijan and such. But that's like, that's a bit of a mind twister, right? Like, and what does that imply? Did the Islamic stuff become a facade at some point or what? Now, obviously, people do, in this world, people do live with double identities for years at a time, so that's a thing. Although, yeah, it's just hard to get one's head around. So I hope we've done some justice to a sort of basic narrative of that, and we can link to presentations where Sibel is talking about this at greater length. But yeah, any comments on that, Adam?
Well, you know, it's interestingly enough, if you look at the backgrounds of intelligence regarding two members, and that's Ayman al-Zawahiri and Omar Abdel Rahman, there's almost this inexplicable link, which is that Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is a known operative who had radical ideals, same as Rahman, and that the Egyptian intelligence, SSI, knew about these two individuals. But what they wanted to do was they wanted to, after the trial of the Sadat's assassination, was that the Egyptian military and the government itself under Hosni Mubarak wanted to expel these individuals, the more influential individuals. And that's what they did with Zawahiri. Actually, Zawahiri was actually expelled. He actually was forced to leave and he went to Saudi Arabia to practice medicine there as well. Rahman was actually expelled, and he actually was given, even though he was under a terrorist watch list at this point by the Egyptian authorities, but he got U.S. visa not once, not twice, but 3 times in a U.S. embassy in Cairo that was headed by agents of the CIA. And this would make your head crack. Why would the United States actually allow a known terrorist operative from Gamma Islamiyah, a radical Islamic group with ties to other radical groups like Tanzir al-Jihad, who was responsible behind Sadat's assassination, to come inside the United States? You know, I mean, at one point, Ayman al-Zawahiri actually came to the United States in 1990.
Yeah, and was collecting money there, right? And that's meant to be he was meant to be collecting money for the Red Crescent for victims of landmines, right? And I've no particular reason to doubt that, other than there was a lot of fundraising going on in the States for Mujahideen groups. 1993 would be like the Bosnian War, right? That was going on at that time. And regarding why Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman was let in, I think I've heard 2 reasons for that. One was because he was running this Al-Qaeda center in Brooklyn, which was a part of the network which was funneling money and young Muslim men across to, well, Yugoslavia, particularly, probably other areas in Central Asia too at that time. So that, and also if there was an Islamic revolution in Egypt ever, the way there had been in Iran only, 12 years before at that point, Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman was like the Ayatollah Khomeini was in Iran. He was the sort of equivalent figure. So it was keeping the Islamic sector on board in case for just future plans of controlling Egypt. So it seems really clear from what we did looking into the 1993 bombing that the CIA were protecting Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman and his network from arrest, particularly after the assassination of Maya Kahani, the Jewish radical, where it was pinned on a lone gunman, al-Said Nasser, when it was just completely obvious there was a much wider conspiracy going on there. So yeah, like Rahman and that network being protected until they went too far and tried to blow up half of New York, and then they all ended up in jail, right? So what's not really clear is how overt these relationships are and how aware the Islamic radical in question is that they're working. They can't be totally ignorant of it, right? Like Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman would have to be kind of thick to think like, oh, I got lucky with my visa again, every time, So they must be aware that they serve Western interests to some degree, unless they just really are quite oblivious people. But like, it's not obvious to me that they like sit down in rooms with CIA agents and say, okay, Mr. Rahman, what we want you to do is put a car bomb in the trade center on this date, where the line is very unclear. And it does appear to me that they are what they say on the tin as regards that they are genuine Islamic radicals who have this particular vision for society. And it's like a marriage of convenience with the Western intelligence agencies. And that will be my take on it. Like Sibel Edmonds goes much further. Sibel has, like, on the one hand, an immense amount of credibility because of she's a bona fide whistleblower, and I think also not total credibility, in that she's also beholden to like whoever's feeding her information from like anonymous whistleblowing sources, and she has had a lot of like turbulent relationships, let's say, with the researchers and journalists she's employed over the years who have walked out and said, she's like makes this stuff up for. She's or exaggerating, let's say, and when one or two people do that, then okay, but it's really quite a big number with Sibel, so that's like very worth listening to. But like, you've got to like listen to her with that in mind, that it's really unclear now what's going on here.
I think you hit the nail on the head regarding that. Most of these people within these fundamentalist groups are unwittingly participants to the whims of, like, say, the Central Intelligence Agency. It's not as simple as the point that in which you raise here, in which they're sitting in a room and talking with CIA agents. Now, I think most of these people, like al-Zawahiri or bin Laden or Rahman, even to an extent Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi from the Islamic State, these are all people who are, I think, unaware that they are doing the whims or the orders or the operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. I think that a lot of these people are manipulated by other informants within the group too. Al-Zawahiri is an intelligent individual. He's highly intelligent, and to think that he's like unaware that there's the hands of intelligence could be permeated within these large-scale groups would be to feign ignorance, I think.
Well, I'll put it this way, Adam. Obviously, when the CIA was supporting the Islamists in Afghanistan in the 1980s, like, every Islamist there must have been aware this is not because the CIA wanted to bring about an Islamist Afghan state. They knew full well that they were fighting, their interest was a proxy war against Russia and bringing down the Soviet Union, which is not particularly the interest of the Islamists, okay? They want to, quote unquote, liberate Afghanistan and bring it into an Islamic state. So that they knew that was a marriage of convenience, right? And they must recognize that that is like still the state afterwards, the state of affairs afterwards, when they're being supported across Central Asia and into Eastern Europe. They've got to have that sense of like, that's why they're allowed to exist and do fundraising in New York City and across the United States.
All right, let me put it to you this way. Ayman al-Zawahiri wrote a book called Knights Under the Prophet's Banner. And in the book, he actually admits that the CIA actually did fund other warlords like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Abdul Rasul Sayyaf of the Northern Alliance, Jalaluddin Haqqani, who was the leader and founder of the Haqqani Network, major big Afghan tribal leaders. These are way bigger than bin Laden ever dreamed to be. And these are the people who actually got millions and millions of dollars from not just the CIA, but the British MI6, the Pakistan ISI, or the Saudi Jihadi, even the Mossad at one point. So Zawahiri even admits, but one thing he states publicly is that bin Laden never received CIA money directly. Now, there's something called the trickle-down effect, where the CIA actually does state in their Operation Cyclone paper, which you can find on PDF, that they did fund the Maktab al-Khidmat, which is the Afghan Services Bureau, headed by Azam, later taken over by Zawahiri and bin Laden after Azam is killed. This office is then extended to United States in New York, Arizona, the two major centers for it, and the funding kept going there. Now, whether bin Laden received the money, I don't think he ever received CIA money directly.
We can't, but there's no proof of that, right? Right.
There's no proof. But I don't dismiss it. But like I said, with the trickle-down effect, that money may have gotten to him in some fashion. Zawahiri even states it in the book, Knights of the Prophet Banner. He goes that the CIA actually likes to be arrogant in their wishes for the Islamists beating the Soviets in Afghanistan, where he says it wasn't the CIA, it was the Islamists who were the reason behind the expelling of the Soviet military.
Well, actually, yeah. I mean, most accounts I've read say that the Afghan Arabs, the foreign fighters, were incidental. Sorry, it was the Afghans that were the major force, and the foreign fighters themselves, like the Zawahiris and the Ladens, were there. Like some accounts say they were just making a nuisance of themselves, basically. That they were nutters who wanted martyrdom. They were going and like waving flags in front of Soviet guns in the hope of being killed so they could go get their virgins in paradise. Whereas the Afghans were overwhelmingly the numbers that, and even CIA money, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was, as we stated before, just the most vile human being you could imagine, right? Like just absolutely medieval in his and how barbaric it was. He's some people believed he was the Soviet double agent simply because his actions, what he did with the CIA's money, was so inefficient that people speculated he was actually working for the other side. And it's likely that he wasn't. He was just like using the funds to position himself by warring with other Afghan groups so that he will come out on top in the struggles in Afghanistan, right? So you could say like, well, how effective was the money going in then? It seemed to be creating more problems than it was solving.
For sure. A lot of that money actually went to the group he headed and founded, which was the Hizb Islamiyah. And I think, it's not proven, I'll speculate here, that a lot of that funding went to the Taliban as well, because he waited until the last minute to join the Taliban, because he actually was friends with Ahmad Shah Massoud, who at that point was now the leader of the Northern Alliance, who was fighting the Taliban for power within Afghanistan in the second civil war. Afghanistan saw two civil wars between the warring factions that were left to fight for scraps for the country. But the second civil war saw the fight between two major groups. And that was the Taliban, headed by Mullah Omar, and the Northern Alliance, headed by Ahmad Shah Massoud. And it wasn't until the Taliban started gaining, until they took over Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, that Hekmatyar actually sided with the Taliban. And I think a lot of that money went to the Taliban, and they took over the country afterwards. And they renamed it the Islamic, I think the Islamic State of Afghanistan or something like that. Don't hold me to it, but Ayman al-Zawahiri was long gone by then. In fact, he went to the Sudan with Osama bin Laden, because bin Laden actually goes before the kingdom, and because Saudi Arabia was fearing Iraq was going to invade Saudi Arabia because they supposedly invaded Kuwait, which we find out which is not true, and that the Iraqi army was at the border of Kuwait and ready to invade Saudi Arabia, but they found out that the photographs were doctored.
Yeah, they did invade, just the way, of course, about how that came across. They obviously did invade Kuwait,
Right.
There was a suggestion that they were lined up on the Saudi border,
Right.
but I think the Russian satellite imagery demonstrated that wasn't the case.
Right.
That they were not. Saddam Hussein was not going to drive all the way to Jeddah.
That's right. In fact, I don't think he would have gotten to the center itself. But anyway, the kingdom was really worried, and they were actually contemplating whether the United States were to come and to, become the military force in which they needed to expel the Iraqi army. So Bin Laden goes before the kingdom, and he produces this outrageous theory that because they expelled the Soviet military, he would use the same Mujahideen fighters to expel the Iraqi army. And the kingdom actually said no. And
it was Prince Turki, wasn't it? Said, "Thank you very much. We'll call you." I think.
Right, for sure.
How he said.
Right, but they were worried. They were worried about the Mujahideen actually invading the kingdom because they allowed the United States to come, and because it's considered the most holiest site in Islam, that Bin Laden said this would be, it's sacrilege to allow the Kafir, the non-believer, to become the force, the military force for Saudi Arabia. So Prince Turki actually goes. This is reported by Lawrence Wright in The Looming Tower, where he says that Turkey did a backdoor deal with Bin Laden and says that we'll unfreeze your assets and give you back your passport, but you have to leave the country. And so he goes to the Sudan, and who follows him? Ayman al-Zawahiri. And Ayman al-Zawahiri takes those same ideological tenets, which I described to you earlier, and then procures them in the fatwa of 1998 in the new organization called the World Islamic Front, where I said that the big quote in there is that you are to kill American and Israeli civilians wherever you find them, which is a stark contrast to the first fatwa Bin Laden and Zawahiri assert in 1996, where he says you are to kill just American military in Saudi Arabia. That was it. But that changes in 1998 because Zawahiri is a leading figure, a major figure in Bin Laden's life, and becomes the ideologue that Bin Laden actually absolves into his ideology. And what I'm saying is that Bin Laden actually wasn't this militant that, the American government actually likes to have you believe, that he was always this militant. He wasn't. And he was actually manipulated by the ideologies of Ayman al-Zawahiri. That's why I wanted to make that clear in the beginning of our presentation, where Zawahiri gets those ideologies and what those ideologies imply for the future. Because what comes after Al-Qaeda, well, the worse, the Islamic State, Ansar Dar al-Islam, all these groups that became the face of Syria, Libya. Look at all these groups now. They're much more radical. To put this in perspective, in 2011, Ayman al-Zawahiri actually makes a video and a declaration that Al-Qaeda wants nothing to do with the Islamic State. So here you have one terrorist organization actually thinking that this organization is much too turbulent and radical in their views. And the reason was because the Islamic State actually kills Shiite Muslims, more so than, say, Israelis or American people. And the biggest killer of Muslims are Muslims themselves, because the Islamic State doesn't represent anything about Islam or the Quran itself. These ideologies are manifested from Zawahiri's ideologies and now almost evolved or de-evolved into this monstrosity that the Islamic State extols now in their beliefs. And that's why you see Islamic State members actually just killing even members within their own group, because they're not extolling this radical view, or they're being too moderate. So, you have to wonder, what comes out of them? More external.
Yeah, well, it's funny how this is a truism about extremist groups, right? Like we saw this in Adam Curtis's documentary about the extremist groups in Algeria. that one of them got down to just having 4 people in who decided they were going to murder everyone else in Algeria, and they could do this. Would be their jihad, right? And I was just reading, just on a different place and time altogether. I was reading one of the biographies of one of the women who was left the Westboro Baptist Church, the famous God Hates Fags church in the States, right? Now, the patriarch that was the head of that whole thing, Pastor Fred Phelps, yeah, he ended up being excommunicated at the end of it, you know, because like the next generation tends to eat the previous generation, you know, because they're not radical enough, not firm enough in their beliefs. So, you know, he was like left to die alone in a state of dementia, and well, going to all the church members was hellbound for it, you know. So it's just a kind of truism about you know, groups that take on hardline ideologies. They tend to, like, every generation surpasses the next in its extremity.
For sure. This actually was also a major point of contention, even, and I'll go back to Tora prison, where all these Egyptian Islamists were in jail. There was an argument between Ayman al-Zawahiri and Omar Abdel Rahman, because Zawahiri and members of the Tanzir al-Jihad thought Omar Abdel Rahman was inept because he was blind and couldn't lead. And they thought that the Gamma Islamiyah group wasn't extolling more radical views in itself, because later on, as we talked off camera before, Gamma Islamiyah actually makes a peace agreement with the Egyptian government. And this actually was something that Ayman al-Zawahiri found to be quite contradictory to what the Tanzir al-Jihad, or the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, was against, because they wanted to keep fighting against the government itself, because they figured that the government is the one that needs to change, and that Gamma Islamiyah was a group that wasn't too radical in their.
Was that after the Luxor massacre they made the agreement?
Yeah, this was after, because that was. I'm glad you brought this up.
Just say briefly what the Luxor massacre was and what year it was. It was I think
96. It was,
no, I think it was 97 actually. I don't know.
90, was it?
I was just calculating. I was in Egypt, and I think it was 6 years afterwards in 2000. So I think it was 97 now. I think, yeah.
That was a huge moment within the Gamma Islamiyah itself, because they actually got rid of Faraj, and Rahman became the leader in absentia, because at this point Rahman's in jail. But that was a negative effect, because it killed so many people within, I think it was like mostly. Yeah,
they machine gun people in Luxor Temple, right, and they shot them in the legs so they couldn't get up. And they walked around and finished them off.
Right, and then they hacked them to death afterwards.
Yeah.
And that, right, and it was like a huge international crime. I mean, major leaders from the United States, the Soviets, even the Chinese, because there was a lot of Asian tourists in the buses itself that were in the massacre within the pyramids itself. I mean, huge international outcry to crack down these groups.
Sure. When I was in Egypt a few years later, actually, everywhere I went, there were like guards with machine guns.
Really?
You know? Yeah. Oh yeah, because they were like super keen to protect the tourist trade, because it just hammered their economy. After that, with people not turning up there. So yeah, sure. Like everywhere, armed guards everywhere. You know, ironically, Egypt, it feels like a very safe country to walk around there, and all the rest. It's a very like friendly and welcoming place. But yeah, there's just like, you know, they were very, very concerned about tourist security.
Well, that's why they hated Hosni Mubarak, because he was such a staunch opponent toward the radical Islamist view. And he was actually, for those who don't know, he actually was injured in Sadat's assassination. He was actually shot in the hand. But there are some people that believe that he may have been a part of the assassination itself. There's no evidence to suggest that.
Brave man if he was, right?
Right, for sure. Yeah, for sure itself, because he was right. He was actually sitting next to Sadat. I think he was one row up where Sadat was sitting at. And then, I mean, you're right in the middle of it. But Sadat was killed immediately. He was shot like 7 times. And, you know, precision shots. I mean, they went right up into the facade, the facade, if you will, that area. But it was like, I think there was 11 or 12 people, high-ranking military members that were sitting there, and Mubarak is sitting right in front of him. And Mubarak actually survived. But it was said that Mubarak actually, because of that, he was really such a staunch opponent to the radical Islamic cell, and I think that was the reason why. Whereas they created the monster that they didn't have to, right? They didn't injure him. But Mubarak became the leader for Egyptian. I think he was the president for 30 years. But even years later, I mean, you have major Islamic organizations that were even that hated Mubarak because of it, and because he expelled all these major leaders. But by doing that too, look what Mubarak did. He created these groups, and they became more radical outside of Egypt. So you wonder if it had the opposite effect in which he wanted. But at least it didn't happen in his backyard of Egypt, right? What does he care about what's happening in the United States or Afghanistan or in Algeria? All these groups that went into other areas as well. But I mean, al-Zawahiri, he's still alive, and here's a guy who's been on the radar for decades and decades, and it makes you wonder, right? How
well, you say he's on the radar. I put his name into YouTube, right, just prior to doing this, and there's a recent clip comes up. It's about 2 months old because he released a video around the time of September 11th this year, celebrating the attack. Okay, all the other videos below that on YouTube are like 5, 6, 7 years old. Right, there's been very little interest in him. I mean, maybe because ISIS has been like the big thing for the past several years now. But as the leader of Al-Qaeda and the number 2 in command of it on the day of 9/11, he doesn't really. No one seems to pay much attention to Ayman al-Zawahiri. He was just hiding out. They suspected in the Afghan-Pakistan region with no real access to phones or anything because you can't, he'd be tracked. But yeah, just surprisingly how like the world's kind of forgotten about him.
Yes, and even immediately after the September 11th attacks, you barely ever heard that name. I mean, it wasn't until after bin Laden's supposed assassination in Pakistan in 2011, then you heard the name al-Zawahiri because he took over as the emir of Al-Qaeda. But even then, afterwards, very, very few journalists would ever report upon the man himself. And here's a guy who has a long, illustrious career in Islamist circles, longer than bin Laden, longer than anybody alive at this point. But what dominated the media spectrum? Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the founder of Islamic State, his predecessor, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But these are people who are short-lived. They don't have that long, illustrious career as al-Zawahiri, and you would think that those in the intelligence apparatuses, like the CIA, like the Mossad, or the Pakistan ISI, would have this guy's face on matchbooks, on posters, on everywhere you go. Nothing. There's literally nothing. Even though there is I believe that it's a $10 million reward for relating information about him. I could be wrong about the amount, but I think it's 10 million.
It's in that region, isn't it? Whether it's
right.
Whether you're out by human, it's enough money to make it.
Right. Let me give you an example. Look what they did with Ramzi Youssef, for example. Okay, I think his reward is a lot shorter, was a lot less than Ayman al-Zawahiri's, and he was found within 2 years. Okay, they had his face on matchbooks. I mean, So now, in fairness, Ramzi Youssef nearly blew up a hotel room, right? And that's how he remained active and did stupid things, which that whole story is to be even partially believed. I mean, the basis of it is true. Right. Then he kind of had he just gone into hiding in eastern Afghanistan, he might have stood a better chance. Okay, but on the same, my counterpoint to that was that al-Zawahiri was actually also behind the 1998 East Africa bombings. In fact, he was actually considered part of it, even though That's questionable, but still he was a part of it. But and also to the September 11th attacks. I mean, he's actually on video when the United States invaded Afghanistan with Suleiman Abu Ghaith, who was the media arm, one of the major media arms of Al-Qaeda, and Osama bin Laden, and he actually is admitting to being a participant. Stuff like I'm just using as an example. Like, here's a guy who everyone in the world is after. I mean, at one point, but he's actually almost forgotten. And yes, I mean, if you Google his name and if you look at video, there's nothing out there. Really, it's almost like a desolate wasteland of information regarding the man himself, which is the reason why we wanted to talk about him today, because there's a lot behind him to understand, and why he's important, and why the ideological background in which he carries to this very day is important to what the groups that we see today came from and what they're formed from.
Well, final point from me, Adam. When we looked at Algeria in the series, part of the reason we focused a bit more on Algeria than Egypt in the sort of early 1990s and the civil war there was because there was more evidence, I suppose, of the Algerian government doing a gladio operation with the Islamist groups, as in there were employees of the government as well as human rights groups, employees blowing the whistle and human rights groups talking about the proximity of Algerian soldiers to massacres, making the claim that the Algerian government infiltrated the Islamist groups and drove them towards a greater level of violence as a way of discrediting them. Okay. There's like evidence for that. And that's, like I say, gladio, that term coming from when the political right in Italy were doing that to the political left as a part of a wider NATO operation to keep communism out of Europe during the Cold War. With Egypt, I'm always less certain, right, of the extent to which the state infiltrated the terrorist groups there and so on. And I don't have such a clear picture. And that comes through when we talk about things like the 1993 bombing and Imad Salem, the quote-unquote ex-Egyptian army officer who infiltrated the cell. But Hamid Mubarak was later quoted in the New York Times saying that they had a man in the cell, right? So who was that? Was that, at that point, was it another guy in the cell? To what extent the Egyptian army and intelligence agents have infiltrated, I don't feel as clear on that.
I've always said that with large-scale terrorist organizations like a Tanzir al-Jihad or a Gamma Islamiyah, you would be hard-pressed not to believe that at some point these intelligence agencies haven't infiltrated these groups in one way or another. I've always felt that way with Al-Qaeda. I feel that way with the Islamic State. And why would it end? Why would it not start with groups like the Egyptian Islamic Jihad or Tanzir al-Jihad? And it would make it easier for these Arab intelligence agencies to infiltrate these groups because why? They already speak the language of Arabic. They are familiar with the organizations and their religious tenets at first, okay? And so it'd be easier for them to infiltrate these groups within itself and gather data, as opposed to say the CIA, a Western intelligence organization, infiltrating Al-Qaeda and having these people mimic the culture of Farsi or Saudi.
Sure,
and
yeah.
There's a group in Israel called the Mr. Arvim, which are a group of Israelis, Arab Israelis, who go and learn the language of Farsi or Arabic, and they're made to understand the culture of the Palestinians or the Arab groups like in Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Palestine and other Arab groups. And they infiltrate these neighborhoods and they stay there for long periods of time. Now, we'll talk about this in a future episode.
Yeah, sure.
But that just goes to show you that these Arab organizations, intelligence organizations like the SSI in Egypt, I think for sure. And I think
maybe someone can, if anyone knows anything about this, drop us a message, because I feel like we made some headway in understanding that in the Algerian situation, and with Saudi Arabia too, right? We were talking before the podcast about Abu Zubaydah, right? The Al-Qaeda recruiter guy who was found in Afghanistan, interrogated by the FBI, and then the CIA tried to freak him out by making out he was in a Saudi prison. And he went, "Oh, thank goodness, my Saudi friends, they'll sort it out. Just call this prince and he'll tell you, they know all about Al-Qaeda. We have a working relationship." And that was kind of the story. So you can see that the Saudi state has this like relationship with Al-Qaeda, but Egypt as a country, like, I don't really know, right? I don't know much about, like, it's been written about that or done about the relationship between the security services and the terrorists there, but maybe there isn't one. But yeah, it's just a bit more of a blank space, Egypt.
Yeah, and meanwhile, this is the origins of Al-Qaeda, right? I mean, Egypt is the basis for most of the Islamist organizations from the 1970s and 80s, which gave way to the organizations that we see today globally in Indonesia or in Iraq, in Libya, for example. All these,
yeah, and ideologically going back to Sayyid Qutb as well. The position, right? So right the way back. Egypt, right, central.
That's exactly right. In fact, you go back far enough, you'll find a starting point for how all this ideologies that permeated today came back to the epicenter of political Islam, as they say, with Sayyid Qutb. And what came after Qutb was like incrementally worse, right? Because after Qutb, you have Ayman al-Zawahiri, you have Muhammad al-Faraj, who I was talking about earlier, and all these more radical individuals, Rahman, and then what came after them, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and all these other far orthodox extremist individuals who have no regard for not just religious tenets, because they don't know anything about. These people don't read the Quran. They're illiterate, most of these people. I'm talking about the muscle, not the leaders themselves, but all these people are basically ignorant regarding the very premise in which they say they're extolling, which is Quran, the Islamic faith itself.
Okay, Adam, in the interest of some degree of brevity, we might start to bring this to a close. Anything more to say on the subject of Ayman al-Zawahiri?
No, I think that's basically about it, Richard.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I found it very educational, and hope our listeners did too. And we'll be back to pick up on a theme. I don't know what will be next time. It might be the Israeli intelligence angle. It might be something to do with Colleen Rowley, the whistleblower we've talked about. We're doing that. So that'll be Zacharias Moussaoui, the 20th Zacharias Moussaoui, the 20th hijacker. We'd be going down that road then. So one of those themes we'll pick up on next time, and hopefully have a guest on at some point too. Thank you very much, Adam.
Hey, thank you, Richard.